to Andy Daniel to introduce our speaker for this morning. Go ahead, Andy.
Okay. Like most of us, my first exposure to China was as a child, and how the starving children in China were so hungry and I should clean my plate because I was fortunate to have enough food. And then walking downtown with my mother shopping in so Chinese pilots in World War II. And then after World War II, anything from China was considered cheap and of low quality. And then all of a sudden, Chiang Kai-Shek and his Methodist wife was being routed out of China by the communists. And so China became this red peril and da-da-da-da-da-da. And nowadays, it's this menacing monster that's everywhere. And I thought it might be interesting to have some perspective on China and to know a little bit more about it. So I set about trying to find somebody to speak to us, and there are not that many people who are knowledgeable. So we're fortunate today to have Professor Matthew Levy from Birmingham Southern speak to us about China and give us some perspective. He's a native of New York and got his undergraduate degree in history from Clark University. He got a master's in Chinese studies from the University of Michigan and later a master in East Asian studies from the University of Chicago. And then he spent a while getting a PhD and beginning his undergraduate teaching career. He taught at the University of Puget Sound and at William and Mary. But he got a PhD in the East Asian civilizations and cultures from the University of Chicago. And in 1993, he came to Birmingham and joined the faculty at Birmingham Southern. His areas of interest are Chinese and Japanese history, along with history of the religions and philosophies of that area, and World War II, both Europe and the Holocaust and wars in Asia and the Pacific. He teaches a number of courses at Birmingham Southern, but the majority are related to East Asia. So I'm very pleased to have Professor Levy with us today, and we look forward to your presentation. Take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm counting on keeping a secret as to how many people you contacted before you contacted me. Boom, that was just a joke. Anyway, so I've slightly retitled the lecture I'm going to present and just called it China in the World, because really what I want to do is to examine China's place in the world today, how the Chinese view themselves in relation to the world, and contextualizing that going back some number of centuries to give you some insight into some of the continuities and discontinuities between earlier Chinese perceptions of its place in the world and contemporary, particularly post, let's say, 21st century conceptions. So the first thing I want to point out is that Chinese intellectuals, Chinese government officials, I think the Chinese populace is educated to think in terms of, to think of their past, their nation's extremely long history, in terms of a sequence of three phases. A phase of greatness, you might call it a pre-industrial phase. China was the dominant power in many ways, culturally, politically, economically, geopolitically, in terms of technological development and scientific inquiry. It was number one for a very long time. And obviously that changed, and it changed with great speed, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries. And the Chinese Communist Party, according to this narrative, has restored China to its position of greatness, except the position of greatness is now in a modernized, globalized, industrialized, mechanized, motorized world. So the first thing you need to understand, and I think this image of trading patterns that dominated the Indian Ocean, you can see in the very right, the South China Sea. Unfortunately, as I uploaded this map, it doesn't show you the Malayan Peninsula, Indonesia. It doesn't show you the bottom section of India, and it doesn't show you a sufficient amount of Africa. But to suffice it to say, between the period of, let's say, about 1000 CE and 1500 CE, China was the geopolitical center of a pattern of interregional trade that encompassed all of the world except pre-Columbian America. Okay? So as far as Asians from East Asia, Central Asia, West Asia, Africans, and Europe, as far as these people knew, that was the whole world. So people often call it, this system that's represented on land and at sea, an Afro-Eurasian world system of exchange. And they use the word exchange because it wasn't simply trade in products, it was trade in technologies, it was trade in armaments, it was trade in religious, philosophical, and cultural ideas. For example, many people are surprised to find out that the most populous Islamic country in the world is not in the Middle East. It is, in fact, Indonesia. So one of the things that you realize when you look at this system as quote unquote the world, the Islamic world is spread throughout. There are lots of African Islamic communities, obviously what we call the Middle East, or what I think should actually be called West Asia. You know, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and such. And many of the so-called stands, you know, Kazakhstan, where Borat came from, a wonderful representative of Kazakh culture, were Islamified. Okay, there was an important Islamic empire in India starting in the early 16th century, and parts of Southeast Asia were Islamic. So the question is, how does Islam spread throughout the world? How does Buddhism, for example, which ends up being a religion that apparently is only good for export because it doesn't really survive in India. It survives everywhere east of India in different forms, in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Vietnam, and such. In East Asia, Tibet, China, Japan, Korea. Okay, so how do these ideas, things that are sort of more amorphous, although they can be very concrete, like Buddhist texts, how do they move around the whole world? Confucian ideas, obviously very important in China, migrate to Korea and Japan, along with Buddhism. So this is a system, an integrated system of exchange in which technologies, woodblock printing, first invented in China well before Gutenberg, okay, gunpowder, the compass, okay, invented in China, yet everybody has it over the course of this 500-year period that I would call the age of Asian hegemony. Okay? And this map is actually a map that includes the blue lines that you see are lines that show maritime trade, and the sort of, I don't know, I guess it's tan, shows what's called the Silk Road. And the Silk Road wasn't just a road. It was a system of exchange with cities. You can see there are all kinds of cities throughout the region, and the eastern end of it was in China, and the western end of it was basically Syria and Palestine, Israel today. And one of the things that's most important is that this system had land routes, it had maritime routes, and because of maritime being easier to transport goods, you know, maritime becomes so much more important, which is why places like Mongolia over the course of time was a big time thing. I'm thinking during when Genghis Khan was alive, okay, but that's a backwater now. But either way, there's still lots of cities. We tend to think of Central Asia as kind of empty, but in fact, it was not empty, okay? So some of these blue lines, particularly in the ones going south from the city of Guangzhou in southeastern China, and they go all the way south through the Malayan Peninsula and the western Java and Sumatra, the western parts of Indonesia, and they cross the Straits of Malacca into the Indian Ocean. And those lines represent the routes taken by a very famous explorer named Zheng He, who traveled, heck, he traveled to Mecca. He traveled to Basra. He went through the Straits of Hormuz. And in his time, there weren't too many oil tankers. So he traveled that entire landscape. And for Chinese nationalists today, all of that represents pre-industrial age Chinese power. And they take pride in it. Okay? However, we all know that China became incredibly weak. And China became incredibly weak for a variety of reasons that are particular to the Chinese landscape in the late 18th and through much of the 19th and into the 20th centuries. But one of those things was the presence, the colonial presence of Western empire builders who dominated not simply China, but much of, well, heck, Africa and much of Asia. So this is a map of the Qing Dynasty. And you can see the Qing Dynasty was enormous. It encompassed all of the territory shown in black lines, sort of grayish and brown, and the striped lines near the south. Okay, all of that was the Qing Empire. And it was essentially, not unlike Africa, partitioned. We've all heard of the scramble for Africa, in which the Western empire builders just basically divided up the entire continent of Africa and turned them into their own colonies. The situation was a little bit different in China. They didn't outright colonize Chinese territory, although Romanov Tsarist Russia took some of the northern tier of China away from China, and we'll discuss that in a little bit. But this is the century of humiliation, okay? And this is a map at the Museum of China, the Museum of the Nation of China. And it's called, the exhibit that it's placed in is called The Road to Rejuvenation. So I translated these phrases. It's lagging behind, China was vulnerable to outside, where's the rest of that? To outside partition, the historical humiliation of the Chinese nation or people. And the map itself is a schematic map of the imperial powers in China at the end of the 19th century, partitioned territory amongst themselves by establishing what are called, or what were called, spheres of influence. Okay, so China started out great, and then China was weakened, and in a weakened condition, it was humiliated. And the concept of humiliation is central to understanding Chinese nationalism. All these things definitely happened. It's not like Chinese historians are making stuff up out of whole cloth. They kind of did that much more under Mao, following Stalin's lead, who was very capable of making up historical narratives, almost out of whole cloth. So there's a historical basis for thinking of China as, you know, a really great power prior to this period, as a country that was beset by internal and external problems during what I like to call the long 19th century. And there's good reason to think that China is stronger today. But when you start using words like humiliation, and then you start using words like rejuvenation, you're politicizing your narrative. And the Chinese do that exquisitely. Now, this is a map of the One Belt, One Road initiative. Coincides tremendously with Chinese geopolitical power, let's say around 1500. Okay, it should be clear that these arrows suggest a similar global, no, not global, a similar vast territorial scope. Okay, so the bottom line is that Chinese nationalism is based on the notion of 3 stages of history: greatness, or heading to greatness and then achieving greatness, then humiliation, mostly ignoring internal causes of it and blaming all the West, and then rejuvenation. The idea of rejuvenation is a critical component of this. Now, one thing that Chinese leaders explicitly say is that the South China Sea is Chinese sovereign territory. Okay, so that's why you get them in with a strong naval presence there, in addition to their trading presence. That's why they're building artificial islands in that region. It's called the 9-segment line. And you can see, let's see, I think the next map shows the 9 segments. Well, there are 9 segments that go around this red territory here. Okay. So the Chinese claim sovereignty over that territory. Obviously, they claim sovereignty over Chengdu and Chongqing and any other parts of China that are part of the People's Republic of China. Lhasa is the capital of Tibet. Okay, but they claim sovereignty over this area as well. And that's a pretty bold claim. That would be like the United States claiming, I don't know, the Eastern Atlantic, or excuse me, the Eastern Pacific as part of the West Coast of the United States, let's say, going out several hundred miles. That clearly is in violation of what our current system of international law recognizes. And obviously, countries like Vietnam are not exactly happy with this, or countries like the Philippines. And to give that some historical perspective, well, I tell you, this is not good. I shouldn't have done it this way. But you can see, this is a map of the Republic of China and its geopolitical claims, made in 1933 when China was pretty much at its weakest. Here's China beset by warlords. Chiang Kai-Shek is trying to reunify the country, and the extent to which he reunified the country is very much compromised by the continued existence of warlords throughout the country. But he's making progress. And he's making progress in a period in which the Japanese are engaged in aggressive, what are called wars of aggression, in the northeastern part of the country, what we often refer to as Manchuria. They already control Korea, and they're extending their control into what's known as the North China Plain. And you put your thumbs up if you can see me moving my cursor. Can you see the cursor? That's the North China Plain. And the Great Wall is sort of right in there. So they're actually in the process of seizing territory just a little south of the Great Wall in the period from 1931 to 1937. And then, of course, all hell breaks loose in 1937. But even at a really weak moment, the Republic of China, the government that was forced off of mainland China by the communists by 1949, makes very similar claims that the People's Republic of China today makes. And there's no reason to think that Chiang Kai-Shek would have had any smaller vision of China's geopolitical power than the Communist Party today. In fact, I didn't include it. Yes, I did. For a long time, the Republic of China, under the leadership of Chiang Kai-Shek, having been removed from the mainland and locating the Republic of China on the island of Taiwan, with its capital in the north, Taipei, continued to make these claims because at least up until the 80s, maybe into the mid 80s, when things really started to change dramatically in the Republic of China, they claimed they were going to retake the mainland. Their geopolitical aspirations was to destroy the People's Republic of China, retake the mainland, and reassert control over not simply continental China, but maritime, the same places. Okay? So what do we learn? First, we learn that Chinese nationalism is not something new. It goes back a good century or so. And even at the height of Chinese weakness in the 1930s and 40s, and even from a distance, Chinese nationalists have asserted control, have asserted the aspiration to control China, obviously, but this region and a little bit of this region west of the Malayan Peninsula, but certainly the South China Sea. Okay? Now, it's also important to understand the continent. When you talk about the continent, you're talking about a rivalry, a long, deep historical rivalry, China and Tsarist the Romanov-Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, and even post-Soviet Russia. So this is a map of territories lost by China during and after the fall of the Qing Dynasty. Okay, and you can see that Russia and the Soviet Union took vast quantities of Chinese territory away from China. The two most famous regions are part of what we call Manchuria. Up until a treaty signed, and it was one of the unequal treaties that European powers imposed on China. All this territory in red was part of Qing China and became part of the Romanov-Russian Empire, and continues to be part of the Soviet Union and post-Soviet Russia. So the current borders reflect territories taken away initially by the Russian Empire in a treaty signed in 1858. The Qing Empire also controlled all of Mongolia, okay? And during the Qing Dynasty, which collapsed in 1912, this region here was called Inner Mongolia, to the south and the east of Mongolia. And this was called Outer Mongolia. And this is the present country, if you sort of divide it right there. This is the present country of Mongolia, and was the the Mongolian People's Republic starting in 1924 the same year the Soviet Union started. Oh no, 2 years after the Soviet Union started, and was a puppet state of the Soviet Union. So when the Japanese were attacking so-called Manchuria, the Soviets occupied this territory. And in fact, in 1938 and 1939, they fought 2 wars in the area around here, the western part of what became the Manchukuo, the Manchu Kingdom of Japan, and Mongolia, the Soviet puppet state. And the one of them was at a place in Japanese called Nomonan. It's right along the border here. It was a 6-month campaign that broke out just before Hitler sent his troops into Czechoslovakia. So World War II related fighting took place here and ended in mid-September, before the Germans sent their legions into Poland. And in fact, when the Germans did that, the Soviets and the Germans had signed the Nazi-Soviet Pact, and they divided up Eastern Europe between them in a secret protocol. And when this battle here ended, the Soviets moved a lot of troops back to Europe and moved them in time to help save Moscow. And the leader of the divisions located in Mongolia was a slightly famous Soviet general named Georgy Zhukov. That name might ring a bell. And his troops were part of the contingent of troops that helped prevent German victory in Moscow just about exactly 2 years later, in 1941. So for our purposes, what this shows is that there's a clear Russian-Chinese rivalry along their massively long border, okay? And you can see from this map, this is a map of Russian and Soviet expansion from roughly the 16th century to the 20th century. And you can see that impingement on Chinese territory in the red areas in the western part, in this greenish area here in so-called Manchuria. So there's a super duper rivalry. And it's something we need to take into account when we think of Chinese nationalism. As significant as Chinese nationalism is today, equally significant is Russian nationalism. And particularly a form of nationalism that's identified with people who claim that Russia should be a Eurasian power, not simply a European power or not simply an Asian power, but both. And they should control the entire continent, is basically what Russians are arguing. And you can see that China and its Southeast Asian neighbors are not considered friends in this. What this means geopolitically in the future is hard to say, because Xi Jinping, the head of China, and Vladimir Putin, the head of Russia, seem to be coordinating to some degree in sort of working against American interests. So when Nixon recognized, or when Nixon traveled to China in the early 70s, and eventually the United States switched recognition from the Republic of China on Taiwan to the People's Republic of China in the mainland, one of the main ideas was to create a synergy between the US and China against the Soviet Union. And in some ways, it seems like it's possible that what the Chinese and the Russians are doing now is sort of doing to America what America tried to do to the Soviet Union. I can't honestly say what will come of that. But suffice it to say that Russian and Chinese nationalism, or nationalists, when they think in terms of China as a global power, they're drawing upon theories expounded by a person who sort of put the academic field of geopolitics on the map. And there were a number of people who did this, but in the European and American world, the most famous is a guy named Halford John Mackinder. And he argued sort of around the turn of the 20th century and as late as the 1940s, that the key for European and American power was to prevent any power, and he had in mind at that time mostly Germany, but to prevent any power from controlling what he identified as this pivot area. And the pivot area extends from, covers basically much of the Soviet Union. Okay, and he argued he who rules the Eastern Europe, in other words, just west of the pivot area, commands the heartland. And the heartland is actually a little bit bigger than this pivot area. Who rules the heartland commands the world island, which is the entirety of Eurasia. Because when you think about it, it's kind of a big freaking island. And who rules the world island commands the world. So geopolitics operates under the assumption that there's at least one power that's trying to rule the world. And this was obviously something very important during the Second World War. Obviously, Japan and Germany were seen, and there are all kinds of images from the war, the period in which the Second World War was being fought, where Americans and British speculated that the Germans and the Japanese were going to meet up somewhere in the area around the British Empire, engage in military conquest, the Japanese going east to west and the Germans and Italians going west to east, and then meeting somewhere in this region and dividing up the world island. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that Americans were very concerned about that. And you can see that in an American response to that, which basically stated, if we can control the seas and this rimland area, we can prevent the world island from being taken over. So wartime and post-war Western, I'll call it Western, geopolitical thought was based on stopping whether it's Germany, whether it's Russia or the Soviet Union, or whether it's China, someone from controlling Eurasia. And the Chinese and the Russians and the Germans, and maybe the Japanese as well, during the war, had ideas of doing precisely what European and American geopolitical strategists were thinking they were planning to do. There is almost zero evidence that the Germans and Japanese were thinking about this, leaving aside the fact that they had enough troubles of their own just in China and in Asia, Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And the Germans had enough trouble of their own in Western Europe and particularly in Eastern Europe fighting the Soviet Union. Neither power had the ability to achieve these objectives. And I sometimes wonder whether any country has the ability, even today, to control the world island. But be that as it may, that's typical for geopolitical thought, to think, that, somebody's going to try and rule the world. And you can see that in, things like George Orwell's 1984 kind of posits that possibility. Okay, so we have a history based on the concept of humiliation and rejuvenation. We have geopolitical conceptions that are vast. And these are not particular to China, although China is the one that we're most concerned with today. It's important to recognize that geopolitical visions of a global nature are kind of inherent to the field of geopolitics. And obviously, people from different countries will think of their objectives differently, but they all kind of think in terms of a global threat that has to be coped with, posed by the other guys. Okay, because we're always the good guys, whether that's Nazis, Bolsheviks, Imperial Japanese, or whatever. Okay, the last thing I want to get across is more of an evidence-based issue. And that's simply the fact that the Chinese have, for centuries, produced maps of their own presence in the world. And there are tons of Chinese maps that have survived going back to about 1,000 years ago. There are no maps that survive prior to them. So all the evidence we have of Chinese tradition of cartography are maps that are less than roughly 1,000 years old, which is plenty old to begin with. But the point I want to make is that Chinese nationalists use maps that often do not pose China's centrality to make the case of China's centrality. So one thing to keep in mind is that the word in Chinese for China literally means, you'll often see it translated as Middle Kingdom. I prefer calling it Central Kingdom. So Chinese cartographers were very much prone to putting China in the middle of the world. And by the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, they were aware of places as far away as Europe. Okay? prior to then, they were not aware of Europe all that much. They were aware of the Arabic world because they had travelers that went to those places. Okay? But by the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, Chinese maps understood that there was a Europe. Okay, now what's interesting about this map, this is called in English the Selden map because it was bought by a guy named John Selden in the 17th century. And he donated it to Oxford University's library, the Bodleian. And Chinese call it the Chinese nautical map of the Eastern and Western Seas. And the Eastern Sea is essentially the western part of the Pacific, and the Western Seas is the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. Now, this is a nautical map. This was drawn by a Chinese who lived outside of China, who was probably a trader, Trader. He probably lived somewhere in Sumatra or the Malayan Peninsula. There's disagreement about who the author of the map is. But either way, he's what we would call in Chinese an overseas Chinese. He's not living in China proper, okay? And he drew this map. And he drew this map, and you'll notice China is clearly not the center of the map. The center of the map is here, somewhere in the South China Sea. So this is a map that studiously avoids making the claim that China's the center of the world. Okay? And it's making that, it's not making the claim that China is the center of the world because the center of this man's preoccupations, whoever he was trade and mapping routes of trade that, if we see a translation of it, includes the eastern coast of China and its links all the way up to Japan and all the way out to the Philippines and all the way south throughout Indonesia. And right here is the southern tip of the Malayan Peninsula, where currently the city of Singapore is. And there's a strait. It's called the Strait of Malacca, and it allows ships of real big size to go from the South China Sea into the Indian Ocean, which he did not picture. But he has various places where it's written out directions of how to get from that eastern part of the Indian Ocean to the western part of the Indian Ocean. Places like the Straits of Hormuz and the Red Sea. There's some question whether Zheng He actually saw Moses and the Jewish people crossing the river. No, that's a bad joke. Anyway. So this map is a business map. It's a map meant for sailors. It's a map meant for business traders who are involved in this trading system that ultimately extends all the way to Europe. Okay, and you can see in there all the places that are listed in this map. Okay, and China's sort of to the northwest. Well, it happens to be the case that this map was drawn during a period when Chinese, I'll call them intellectuals, when Chinese intellectuals and Jesuit intellectuals came into contact with each other. And the Jesuits were a particularly important Roman Catholic order used by the church to counter the Reformation. So we know about there being a Protestant Reformation and a counter-Reformation. And counter is quite literal. They're trying to counter the strength, the growing strength of the Protestant world. And they kind of felt like if they could gain adherents in East Asia, they could not only deal with the Protestant threat to Roman Catholicism, but the Islamic threat to the entire world of Christendom. So these guys, these Jesuits, went to China hoping that they could convert the Chinese people to Christianity. And they decided to do it in a top-down way. If we can convert the emperor and his leaders, his ministers, they would then facilitate the conversion of all the Chinese people. And different Catholic orders took different approaches. Some took a bottom-up approach. So the Franciscans and the Dominicans were very successful in Japan, very successful in the Philippines and other parts of Southeast Asia in spreading Catholicism. Very, very successful in Africa too. Okay, but the idea was that if we can exchange with the Chinese, that would block, that would cordon off, that would create a geopolitical sort of two-front war, kind of. Now, in the process of contact between Chinese intellectuals and these Jesuits, the Jesuits transmitted the concept of the earth being round to the Chinese. The Chinese were unaware of that. And so you can see this is a map drawn by Jesuits. They became fluent in Chinese, and they drew a map of the world that indicated its round shape. The borders are meant to suggest that. Okay. And this is a mind blower to Chinese intellectuals. They weren't aware of it. And for a time, some of them accepted it. And you can see that this is based on that Jesuit map written by a guy named Zhang Huang. Okay. And he shows pretty much, it's a little less precise, pretty much what the Jesuit map showed in a Chinese map. But, and this, by the way, cancel that but. This is the European equivalent. The Mercator Projection, the famous Mercator Projection, which we use almost universally, created in 1569 by Gerardus Mercator. And you can see this is centered on the Atlantic. So this, they put the Atlantic world, as pretty much we're accustomed to, around the center. And the Ricci map, the Jesuit map, has the Pacific Ocean as the center, and actually puts the Americas off to the right, which any map of the world that puts the Pacific Ocean at the center is going to put the Americas on the right. And that seems kind of weird to us'ns, because we're accustomed to seeing the Americas on the left, and we're accustomed to that because we see the Atlantic as the sort of central point of reference. Well, it is perhaps not surprising, but Chinese cartographers ultimately rejected the spherical concept. And so this is supposed to be China. And this is the northern tier of China's borders, and Africa I'm sorry, the India and the Africa, India. No, this is India. I'm sorry, India's here. The Arabian Peninsula, and then the Middle East and Europe is located in this western edge. And it's obvious that this makes no attempt to be sort of accurate. This makes an attempt to be accurate. This makes an attempt to be accurate. Okay, maybe not quite as good. This makes no attempt to be accurate. Okay, China is literally the center. Okay, China is literally Zhongguo, the central kingdom. And all these other places are periphery. And I want to suggest that in a new context, Chinese nationalists are reviving this kind of vision. They can't use a map as inaccurate as this map is to represent their views, but they can use this one, or they can use this one. Okay, so in a new cartography, a new form of cartography, Chinese nationalists lay specific claim to the South China Sea and claim, you know, some kind of influence over much of the rest of Eurasia. Russians have similar views. It claims, you know, some kind of geopolitical status over much of Eurasia. And we're living in a world today where the world is competition amongst at least three major powers. And who knows, maybe George Orwell got it right. I don't know. I'm not going to speculate on it, but when you really think about it, George Orwell posited three countries, and they would shift alliances all the time, depending on how things would shake out at any one moment in time. And there are all kinds of other implications of that book that relate to totalitarianism. But this is basically, if you're going to understand Chinese nationalism, you have to place it into that kind of historical context that goes back several centuries and a global context that covers essentially the world after the Second World War. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you, Dr. Levy. I have maybe just a comment or a question having to do with the fact that China has made some real inroads in Africa in providing, well, what it sounds like almost an attempt at colonizing, in a way, some areas of Africa. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that Chinese imperialism is using some of the techniques of Western imperialism to gain influence in various parts of the world, and Africa is one of them. You could see here that they think of Africa as part of this, part of this region. Now, this map is a little inaccurate. They do take Africa seriously. They think they have an edge in Africa because European and American policy really hasn't helped African economies terribly much. So they see They see an opportunity to take advantage. And they're definitely doing that. And in fact, they take some of these maps,
Well, they gotta make it more easy to do.
which don't necessarily show China at the center of the world, like that Selden map, and shop them around all over Africa and have exhibits in Johannesburg or various other parts of Africa, cities in other countries of Africa, and show, see, you're together with us. We'll create a new world order that will be beneficial to you. We'll give you all kinds of loans to build infrastructure. Then, of course, those countries will default on those loans. And when countries default on loans, you have leverage over them, political and financial leverage over them. And the Western empires of the 19th and 20th century did that constantly to the Chinese, lending them money that they knew they wouldn't be able to pay back, giving them leverage, forcing them to continue repayments and give further concessions and so on. So
Aren't a lot of
the tools,
aren't a-
hold on, the tools of Western imperialism, the Chinese are currently using today.
and Western imperialism more or less came to an end, but the Chinese are now encountering a lot of resistance in a number of those countries,
Yeah.
aren't they? Because of that they're at that point where the countries are realizing they've been screwed and are getting truculent, shall we say.
Yes, truculent. Yes, they are. Now, how successful they'll be, where this will go in the next 20 to 50 years, I'm not going to hazard a guess. But what your point, Daniel, reveals is that the tension between Chinese aims and the aims of the recipients of those loans have changed. The recipients were like, sure, give me loans, give me loans, give me loans. But over the course of time, realized the negative effects, even though lots of infrastructure is being built in their countries.
And the Monroe Doctrine is a bit in peril too, isn't it? Because aren't the Chinese moving a lot into South America? And I know they're doing some business things and some massive projects, but they're also selling their vaccine in a couple of South American countries.
Right. Good luck to them. Yeah, I mean, the Monroe Doctrine was an imperialist doctrine. It was a doctrine that said Latin America is the preserve of the United States. Okay. The Japanese, for example, when they tried to create, I love this phrase, one of my all-time favorite lie phrases, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, basically claimed that they were doing a Monroe Doctrine. If you guys can do it in the Atlantic and the Eastern Pacific, we can do it in the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean. Okay. So yeah, the effects of imperialism are not only negative on the colonized or the former colonized, but they've had profound negative impact on us because it's easy to copy those methods.
I have a question. It looks to me as though they're making claims related because of trade routes. What about the warlords? For instance, when Chiang Kai-Shek went to Taiwan, did he claim it as a territory because he was a warlord? Or do they claim it? Do they claim other places? Do they colonize them? It doesn't sound as though they do.
Okay.
Does that make
this gets us into a lot about the history of Taiwan under the leadership of Chiang Kai-Shek and his successors. So Chiang Kai-Shek fled mainland China in 48 and 49. And in fact, he conquered Taiwan. The Taiwanese, the native population, was not exactly happy about being occupied again, because they were occupied by the Japanese for a long time, and now come Chinese. And there's a history of Taiwanese resistance to Chinese rule that goes back at least to the 17th century. Okay, so when we talk about Chiang Kai-Shek leaving or being exiled or being pushed off the mainland, okay, we're talking about a conquest. And that's not something that's fully understood outside of Taiwan. Now, while he was president, he too died. He and Mao died the same year, which is somehow some form of poetic justice. Up until then, as I showed on that map, he claimed all of China just as much as People's Republic and Mao did. And he also made claims to these parts of, well, you can't see it here, but the South China Sea is down where the writing is. And you can see some of the islands there. Okay. After he died, his son took over, and during his period of rule, he initiated political reforms that led to Taiwan being basically an independent country that really just wants to be an independent Taiwanese country. It doesn't want to be part of the mainland. It doesn't want to be associated with the mainland population that migrated with Jiang in the 40s. It just wants to be its own place. So for example, just maybe a week or two ago, the Republic of China, Taiwan, changed the printing of the cover of its passport.
Yeah.
Because
really?
since recognition was switched to the mainland, they've been known as the Republic of China, Taiwan, or the Republic of China, Taipei, like at the Olympics. So Republic of China and Taiwan are written on Taiwanese passports, but they increased the size of the word Taiwan and reduced the size of the Republic of China. To me, that's very emblematic of how people of Taiwan view themselves. They want to be an independent country. They want to really disavow any connection to China, except obviously trade and business. They certainly don't want to be what the People's Republic of China calls them, the province of Taiwan. So there's like, they're caught in between. And where that will go is hard to say. I don't see any positive options. Unfortunately, I don't think the People's Republic will recognize them as an.
What year was it was called Formosa, and what year was it that they started calling it Taiwan?
It's hard to say because you'll see Taiwan during the Qing Dynasty. I'm not really sure about that.
I thought it had to be like around 59, 60, 61.
I mean, some people continued to use Formosa, but most Chinese did not. Most Chinese called it Taiwan.
What was the what did the Japanese call Taiwan?
Taiwan.
Taiwan or Formosa? I'm
I think they called it Taiwan. I'll have to check that.
okay.
Let me ask you a minor question or an esoteric one. I knew a fella that flew on the Doolittle raid, and his plane had the carburetor changed on the Hornet while they were shipping out, and after they bombed, they were supposed to do the best they could to get to China.
Right.
And they did the best they could, but they didn't know where the hell they were. And they landed on land that when they were about to run out of gas, and if depending on the color of the people that came out was where they were going to try to take off again or not. Anyway, he ended up landing in Russia. And the Japanese wanted to have him extradited to Japan and kill him. And the Russians didn't do that. But they claimed that it was because they had a treaty with the Japanese from the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 5. But you say that they fought in Manchuria or Mongolia in 1938. Did they ever have a treaty, or they just quit fighting, or they just sort of dwindled,
they
or
did
what?
have a treaty that was still in force, even though there was no longer the Romanov dynasty. That was still in force between Japan and the Soviet Union. Okay. They did fight significant campaigns in 1938 and 1939. But after Germany invaded, or in anticipation, I should say, of the potential of a German invasion of the Soviet Union, Stalin made one correct move, at least in terms of protecting his country. He signed a non-aggression, or a neutrality pact with Japan in April of 1941. So the Germans attacked a couple of months later. And in fact, the Japanese were contemplating whether to attack the Soviet Union, the eastern frontier of the Soviet Union, and try to sort of force the Soviet Union to fight a two-front war, which it most likely would not have been able to do. But for a variety of reasons, the Japanese decided not to interfere because, in part, they were already bogged down fighting in central and southern China, and they didn't have the troops to fight in China and to fight the Soviet Union. And in fact, for much of the interwar period, the Japanese high command was divided over whether they wanted a war in China or they wanted to fight the Soviet Union. The army was particularly in favor, the Imperial Japanese Army was particularly in favor of fighting the Soviet Union because they saw the Soviet Union, much like the Nazis did, as a threat. And that means that in 1937, when full-scale war broke out, the Japanese were kind of like, well, what do we do? Do we send more troops? Do we build this up into a huge full-scale war? Or do we try to keep the conflict local to preserve the opportunity to do the Soviet invasion? And essentially, Chiang Kai-Shek called their hand. Prior to 1937, Chiang Kai-Shek had basically appeased the Japanese. And for a variety of reasons, he decided in 1937 he wasn't going to do that anymore. So he upped the ante and forced the Japanese to, send massive troops into central China to fight Chiang Kai-Shek. And that made it impossible for them to do a full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union. The best they could do, which is what they did in 1939, was fight a border war. The Soviets spanked them.
Professor Levin, there are obviously going to be some changes in the United States position and policy toward China with the change in administration. What recommendations would you have for the Biden group coming in as to U.S. policy toward China, both military, economic, and as far as democracy is concerned?
Well, that's tough. You added that democracy thing. We are in no position to dictate the internal policy of the Chinese. We can't. We're in roughly the same position we were in 1945, 46, 47, 48, and 49, vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. It was, short of an all-out invasion, there's nothing we can do about Chinese domestic policy in a really serious way. We can push and we can try to make agreements so they stop sending Uyghurs to concentration camps and stop beating up Hong Kong people and all that kind of stuff. But that's sovereign Chinese territory. And we're limited. I think we have to find a balance between a reassertion of military and diplomatic power, balanced with hope that we can create enough friendship to move forward. The thing I worry about is people who want to precipitate military conflict. And if you're going to precipitate military conflict with a country like China or a country like Russia, the costs are just too high. And you have to make sure that Russian leadership and Chinese leadership agrees that the costs are too high. And the Soviet and American leadership agreed with that during the Cold War. As vociferous as the Cold War was, okay, and the kinds of proxy wars that we fought, the Soviet leadership understood, as did the American leadership, that full-scale war was. So I think we need the same kind of approach.
Do you see trade as perhaps even expansion of trade as being something that might at least lessen the possibility of a military?
Yes, because the more our economies are intertwined, the more that is you can lose by having war.
China has such a homogeneous society that do you see any real military threat to other countries in Southeast Asia from the Chinese? The Chinese moved as traders and entrepreneurs throughout the region, but it seems to me that China is trying to firm up its position in the South China Sea, but do we really have anything to fear from military aggression to try to take portions of China or India or any of the
I think the main threat is Taiwan. I think if the Chinese are going to be aggressive militarily, that would be the place.
That has some historic basis, I think, as you pointed out.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And honestly, I don't even want to say anything about that possibility. It's too horrifying to contemplate. Yeah, I mean, China's has got a huge military, and it's a huge naval power too. So it's a threat. Any nation that has the naval forces that a country like China has, and the army forces, we're a threat to them, they're a threat to us. Mutually assured destruction is the thing to keep in mind.
Chinese have any anticipation or plans to reclaim any of the lands that Russia took?
I doubt it. I think, like that map I showed, that's just venting at the moment anyway. It's hard for me to imagine the Chinese and the Russians, I mean, that would take full-scale war.
So they'll since they've got somebody tough on that border, they'll leave that alone, but they've got these weaker countries scattered around on the
all big powers behave that way. The Chinese are not unique in that. The Americans have done that. I mean, look at Czechoslovakia, okay? Or look at Prague in the 1950s. Little country, big superpower, forget it. Okay. That's the nature of big powers are bullies. I don't care if you're the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, or the British. They're bullies. Bullies. Lynn, did you have a question?
Yes, Korea, how does that fit in? I know, or does anybody even want it? I don't think they want the North part.
Yeah, I don't, I think we're just going to live through, well, when I think of Korea, I think of Iran too. And I think what needs to be done is a new agreement with Iran to fix up the weaknesses of the agreement that Obama made. And Obama made that agreement because he was, I think, thinking in a short term and long term. Short term, denuclearize Iran. Long term, maybe we can deal with these other problems that Iran creates. And I think the same is true with Korea. We need some kind of agreement that allows all sides to feel secure. And,
Okay.
because, when you think about it, they've kickstarted their missile programs again. And the Iranians, for all the faults of that Obama treaty, it did stop their nuclear program. Okay, it didn't stop their sponsorship for terrorism, but that wasn't the purpose of it. Okay, and maybe you could have built some goodwill that way. I don't know. I mean, it's Iran and the Sunni world are at loggerheads, so I'm not sure whether that ultimately would be possible. But that's a real accomplishment, to denuclearize a country, and now they're nuclearizing, or as W like to say, nuclearizing. So yeah, I mean, Korea, I would put them in the same place as Iran. Something has to be done, because it's clear that leadership sees its survival in the possession of nuclear weapons.
Are there any further questions?
Leverage. What?
Are there any further questions from any of our participants here this morning?
Going once.
Well, thank you, Dr. Levy. I've enjoyed this talk, and I know that our members have too. And we thank you for coming to speak to us this morning.
It was a pleasure. I hope it gave you some food for thought.
And we will see everyone next week. Remember to tune into the inauguration in case you don't have that on your calendar. And then on Thursday, we will have another speaker.
And don't forget your meeting tomorrow, too.
We will have our Friday forum tomorrow. And please, if you would like to join us, check in with that.
Thank you much.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate it.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Appreciate it, too.
Excellent, excellent lecture. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.